Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to class 113. This class is going to be sort of a bringing together of several things we've talked about in the last several weeks. Particularly, we're trying to bring to closure this idea that I started with about the mind of God and the structure of reality. This is, as I mentioned before, something I hope to write a book about, and I've started on it. And so consequently, probably will pause again with these meetings in after about five more sessions, which should close together both this discussion about really the interplay between the two dimensions of reality, the spiritual and the physical, which been talking about insofar as physics is concerned and metaphysics. And we're going to talk about that a little more tonight and try to bring that part of it to closure, as well as talk about the importance of prayer and how it works in relation to this interplay between the two realms. In other words, one of the fundamental premises of the Baha'i faith is that God does intervene in human history, or to put it more precisely, God directs human history, but not directly, not by personally, as we have portrayed in sort of a mythology of the Old Testament, as a person or directly speaking to individuals or directly affecting physical phenomena. Rather, that God empowers his manifestations to carry out his will, and that they have, from their position of authority and power, the capacity to influence history. Though, as we mentioned over and over again, the methodology for teaching us that God has devised is that it requires our free will and our participation rather than being imposed on us. So even if we say God intervenes in human history by sending the manifestations do not physically alter events. Rather, they bring teachings which indirectly influence the progress of human learning and human thought, and thereby alter the course of history. This is very important when you get to questions about why, if God is just and loving, does God, and omnipotent at the same time, why does God allow injustice to occur? Why does God allow the demonic figures of history to succeed in their endeavors? So we hope to pull all of that together. So let me begin by sharing my screen, and we'll go to tonight's presentation, which is the prayer as action at a distance. Now, we've been talking about action at a distance as a very important subject in regard to physics and cosmology, particularly Newtonian physics, which posited the theory that action at a distance does occur. And in fact, it's the organizing force of the universe, because every mass is attracted to every other mass. We responded to that, or rather physics did, and we examined a little bit of it with Einstein's theory that action cannot occur at a distance. By that, we mean that there can't be some influence without a physical relationship between two objects, not in the physical world. So when we say, Einstein rejected the idea that two masses could just be attracted to each other without there being some intervening connection. And of course, Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, as we've noted, has said the same thing, that there's no such thing as a void, that space is a field of matter, of what he calls ether, though his expression of ether is couched in right at the time that quantum physics, or fields of matter were being understood and explored and proven. So let us go forward with connecting both of these two things together as they're discussed in terms of prayer and as they're discussed in terms of theories of physical attraction. I want to begin with just a statement of my own to conclude where we are at this point. We don't understand the future of what studies of the cosmos or quantum physics will bring forth, nor do we understand with any, that should be completeness, the interrelationship between the Baha'i explanation of all this and that of science. All we do know is that over the course of time, these two sources of knowledge, secular and sacred, will converge and complement each other in such a way that knowledge will not be compartmentalized, nor will reality itself be perceived as dualistic, but rather as a unified expression of the Creator's methodology to fulfill his objective, to be known, loved, worshipped, and to engender a bilateral love relationship that will benefit humankind individually and collectively in both the earthly and celestial stages of spiritual development. So what I'm trying to say here, and I should have edited that more carefully, what I'm simply concluding is what I'm trying to bring us to in this talk and the next few talks that we will try to bring closure to this concept of how the structure of reality fulfills God's wish to be known and worshiped, is that there is ultimately no distinction, that both aspects of reality are really different features or different dimensions of a single unified, organically functioning reality. So on the one hand, we're saying, yes, there is an influence between one dimension and the other, and the principal dimension in this relationship is the spiritual realm. And yet we're saying, we're agreeing with science that it doesn't occur directly. The hand of God does not reach down and change something. And this explains, in one sense, why there seems to be this injustice in the world. Why doesn't God correct it all? Well, God has brought about a process whereby we ourselves are mandated to do this. So the interpenetration, which is a word my brother liked to use, between the twin dimensions of reality. He was, as a theoretical mathematician, very much concerned with this subject and used, as I mentioned last week, used the tools of theoretical math to demonstrate that that science, in effect, can describe this process. Interpenetration, in this sense, means each dimension affects the other, that they are collateral in their operation, but not necessarily in a direct sense. So we see this most obviously in our own existence. We are essentially spiritual beings, the Baha'i writings say. We have a soul that is the essence of our reality. From it emanates our consciousness, our memory, our willpower, our rational thought, and so on. So all that is distinctly human about us emanates from this spiritual reality that operates temporarily in this part of our lives, these, as one prayer says, in the early days of my life, indirectly through the intermediary of the brain, even as God operates indirectly through the intermediary of the manifestation, and the manifestation operates indirectly through the intermediary of the word. How to know when prayers are answered. So we're dealing with something here that we talked about time before last when we discussed two experiments that seem to indicate that there is a relationship that's demonstrable, scientifically replicable between prayer, our willpower, and material action. And so one was the prayer experiment that was discussed in the book by Dawsey, how they prayed for cardiac patients. The ones that were prayed for did better than those that weren't prayed for. And then the other experiment, which had nothing to do with prayer per se, but where you had a group of people willing that the balls on a Gaussian table would fall more to one side than the other, rather than a strictly centered bell curve. What is causing the prayer may itself be the answer to the prayer. Now, what I'm talking about is that if we were not mandated to pray by God, if it weren't in effect one of the laws of the Baha'i faith, when would we pray? Well, if we are devoted people, we might pray all the time and pray as much as Baha'u'llah has commanded us to do. But more than likely, we would pray in times of great joy or great suffering, when we feel like praising God for what we are experiencing, or else pleading with God to help us in times of test and consternation. We have this assurance in one of the prayers of Baha'u'llah. He is the prayer-hearing, prayer-answering God. One can infer from this that this implies that every prayer is answered, but perhaps the prayer is not answering according to our desires or expectations. In other words, maybe the suffering we are caused to endure, or that we are praying for someone else who is suffering to have a surcease of their sorrow. Perhaps that suffering has an ultimate benefit to our existence or to theirs. And so it may cause us to reevaluate our lives or our present course of action. And in some cases, we're praying for someone to live and not die because they are on the verge of death. We say, oh, no, God, let them endure. No, perhaps demise is the best path for the advancement of a soul, especially if he or she has endured or is enduring overwhelming affliction. So we don't really know what is best for ourselves or for others. And so ultimately, as Christ teaches in what is called the Lord's Prayer, which is really guidance about how to pray and what to pray for, thy will be done. That's the most important prayer we can pray in one sense, and that is, we don't know what is the best course of action for ourselves. How many times has something that seemed to be detrimental to our lives ultimately brought about some great progress in our development? The difficulties of one may be enhancing the spiritual progress of others. That's another take on this. So needless to say, this discussion could go on for hours and is well worth reflecting and discussing. Then we can come to this. This question came up in the Q&A after that discussion 2 weeks ago, and that is, does prayer have to include God or his manifestations as intermediaries to be effective? In other words, when the people were thinking about making the ping pong balls go to more than one side than the other in the John and Dunn experiment we discussed 2 weeks ago, that wasn't prayer, and much less was it prayer to God to make something happen. And indeed, one of our participants said that she knew of a group that simply prayed that the universe would help, drawing on universal forces. Well, the universe itself is not a sensate being and not a cognitive being or a personal God. We are told from the Baha'i writings that God is a personal God, that God cares for us individually and collectively, and ordains for us that which is best for us. So the notion of praying to the universe or simply praying without the intermediary or assistance of God as manifestation, or in the case of the Baha'i faith, Abdu'l-Baha, may be well intended and may be accepted by God and thus have some effect. In other words, God may say, well, this is an altruistic and benign thing, so I will assist these people. But lacking awareness of the source and nature of spiritual power will perhaps diminish the effectiveness of prayer. So clearly, and we'll talk about this later tonight, when Abdu'l-Baha talks about spiritual healing, and he talks about the fact that healing can take place through physical means, obviously, and admonishes us to seek the advice and assistance of the best physicians we can find and physical remedies. But he also says spiritual influence can have a redemptive effect on our physical well-being, but only very slightly so. So he says, even in being in the presence of a healthy person can have a detectable, in some cases, influence on the mending or healing of a sick person. But he explains it in physical terms. In other words, he doesn't just say this is some mystical thing. Excuse me. But rather that he talks about the molecular aspect of the influence. So he gives it, in effect, even spiritual healing has a physical, utilizes physical properties. So it's not, strictly speaking, action at a distance. So is prayer really action at a distance? The John and Donne experiment, I've already mentioned, this influence was not of a spiritual nature, but merely the influence of thought and will. And so perhaps, as John and Donne determined, the influence was the activation on the quantum level of certain molecular activity brought on by our willpower. Perhaps our willpower can influence quantum activity. We don't know. Perhaps the best explanation of this result does indeed involve the ability of the mind to set in motion action at the level of a quantum field, though even as the experiment demonstrated, and even as Abdu'l-Baha says, at a very minimal level, a very minuscule level. So even if it has such influence, it's very, very little. And yet Abdu'l-Baha says that even the physical presence of a healthy person can have a degree of healing power on someone who is ill. As to the two material, and this is from Abdu'l-Baha, I should put that in quotes. As to the two material kinds of healing, one is due to the fact that in reality, both health and sickness are contagious. This is very interesting. The contagiousness of disease is rapid and violent, whereas that of health is exceedingly slow and weak. If two bodies are brought into contact with each other, it is certain that the microbial particles, will be transmitted from one to the other. In the same way that disease is rapidly and violently transmitted from one body to another, something the pandemic has shown us. The strong health of a healthy person may also alleviate a very slight condition in a sick person. Our meaning is that the contagiousness of disease is rapid and violent, while that of health is very slow and of limited effect, and it is only in minor ills that this modest effect can be felt. In such cases, the strength of the healthy body overcomes the slight weakness of the sick body and brings about its health. This is one kind of healing. And this is also Abdu'l-Baha. Another kind of healing is through the force of bodily magnetism, where the magnetic force of one body affects another body and brings about the cure. Now, he's not talking about magnetism in the sense of Newtonian physics. Here he's talking about the interplay of magnetism in the terms of electromagnetic fields. This force too, and I will mention later on, and I hope you follow up on it, a talk on this subject given by former House of Justice member, now deceased, Peter Kahn. It's an excellent talk about magnetism in relation to spirituality. This force too has only a slight effect. Thus, someone may lay his hand upon the head or stomach of a patient, and perchance the latter will benefit from this. Why? Because the effect of the magnetism and the impression made upon the psyche of the patient may dispel the disease, but this effect is also very slight and weak. So in other words, while this kind of healing has sometimes taken on a great following, this kind of spiritual healing, Abdu'l-Baha is stating very clearly here that indeed such things can have some slight effect, but not very much. So he's not saying don't do it, but what he is saying is that physical healing is the primary means by which you should seek to cure yourself or someone else. One, and he's talking about here another kind, one kind of healing is when a healthy person focuses the whole attention upon a sick person. And the latter, the sick person, in turn fully expects to be healed through the spiritual power of the former and is wholly convinced thereof to such an extent that a strong connection is created between their hearts. Now, again, is this action at a distance, or is there some physical phenomenon taking place? And the answer is, we don't know. I would infer from what Abdu'l-Baha is saying that there is some physical interaction. Should the healthy individual then bend every effort to heal the sick one, and should the latter have full faith that health will be attained, an excitement may be produced in his nerves from these soul-to-soul influences and bring about the cure. May, in some instances, bring about the cure. And again, he's not suggesting that this is a methodology that should be employed in every case. He's not saying it's not helpful. He's just simply saying it can possibly have an influence. In brief, a complete and perfect connection between the spiritual physician and the patient, that is one where the physician concentrates his entire attention on the patient, and where the patient likewise concentrates all his attention on the spiritual physician and anticipates healing, causes a nervous excitement whereby health is regained. But this is effective only to a point, and not in all cases. For instance, should someone contract a grave illness or be physically injured, these means will neither dispel the illness nor soothe and heal the injury. That is, these means have no sway over grave illnesses unless assisted by the constitution of the patient, for a strong constitution will often ward off an illness. All right, let me take a sip from my tea, and we will get to magnetic attraction, where we do have, we're sort of switching. Well, we're not really switching. We're sort of looking into the physical interaction between objects at a distance. We will go back now. If you remember, 3 classes ago, we talked about the Michelson-Morley experiment, where it was tested, where the speed of light was tested going with the ether and against the ether, or what was considered to be the ether. And the experiment demonstrated that the ether had no effect on the speed of light. That speed of light is the same when viewed from whether you're going with the light or against the light. The concept of an ether seemed to be thereby disproved. In other words, where it really was determining the nature of light, the inference by most was, well, there must not be any ether. Whereas an alternative inference from that experiment is that there is some kind of ethereal material, because there can be no void, it does not affect a photon of light or waves of photons of light, since light can be studied both as particles and as waves. Newton's law seemed to be disproved by Einstein's theory of general relativity, and indeed it was. In other words, there is no inherent attraction between masses, but rather, as general relativity described, you still have an effect on matter between the objects, and we'll see how that works and how it looks. General relativity is a physical theory about space and time, and it has a beautiful mathematical description. According to general relativity, the space-time is a four-dimensional object that has to obey an equation called the Einstein equation, which explains how the matter curves space-time. Now, what he's talking about is this right here. This is Newtonian gravity up at the top. And you can see the idea of Newtonian physics is this: the moon here is inherently attracted to the Earth to the extent of the mass of the Earth and the mass of the moon and the distance between them. And so the Newtonian formula for determining the force of gravity puts into play the size or mass of these two objects, the distance between them, and that equals the force. Whereas general relativity says this object actually bends space. Well, if space is void, how can it be bent? Because it doesn't exist. And of course, Baha'i himself says there's no such thing as a void, that all matter swims in a sea of matter more refined than itself. So here you see the impact on space-time, or simply space, since time is sort of an anomaly in a way. That is, some theorists don't even believe time is a function. It is simply a device we create to make sense of our own world. Suffice it to say, whether you consider this sort of sheet or bedspread looking thing as space or space-time, because it has an effect on time, the moon, thus, once it approaches the Earth, or is with a certain proximity, as in its movement, instead of going straight at the Earth, it starts to curve down and circle around like a marble in a laboratory, for example, in a sink. It rolls around like that. But of course, it keeps rotating because it never loses its forward motion. So here's a bigger picture that's perhaps a little more comprehensible. And so the Earth, of course, is doing the same thing in relation to the sun. If this were the Earth and this were the sun, you would have this same thing taking place. So the larger the mass, the more imprint it makes on space-time. Now, the problem with this explanation for me is simply that it's implied that it's four-dimensional, but of course, this is up and down. You think, well, wait a minute, it's not just bending space-time, from top to bottom, because there is no top and bottom in space. It can go in any direction. So it's bending space-time up here, up here, up here, depending on where it's approaching from. So if it's approaching from this angle, then space-time is bent this way. You get my point, I'm sure. Nevertheless, this is Einstein's theory, and it is used today. It's only used in great distances, but as we'll see in a moment, what you'll find there are some practical everyday instances in which you use that theory. To summarize the two views of gravity, Newton envisioned gravity as a tug of war along the line connecting the two objects in the universe. In other words, each is attracting the other, so they're pulling against the others and pulling the other towards itself. In contrast, Einstein envisioned gravity as a bending of space-time by mass. Another difference between Newton and Einstein is that Einstein's theory recognizes that the source of gravity is not mass, as Newton believed. The speed limit on the universe was also a challenge to the inherent assumption in Newton's law of gravitation that gravity is an action at a distance force, that is, without physical contact. Any change in the position of one mass is instantly communicated to all other masses. This assumption does not come from any first principle, as Newton's theory simply does not address the question. The same was believed of electromagnetic forces as well. It is fair to say that most scientists were not completely comfortable with the action at a distance concept. So here we're comparing, excuse me again, a little hoarse tonight. We're comparing physical theories of action at distance with spiritual theories of action at a distance. So the first observation of light deflection, and this is the proof of Einstein's theory, was performed by noting the change in position of stars as they passed near the sun on the celestial sphere. The observations were performed by Arthur Eddington and his collaborators during the total eclipse of May 29, 1919, when the stars near the sun, at that time in the constellation Taurus, could be observed. The result was considered spectacular news and made the front page of most newspapers. And here's how it worked. Light, which travels in a straight line, according to Einstein, at a constant speed. And so in his formula, C is the constant, is the speed of light. And here's the location of the stars, apparently. But what really is happening is the sun is causing a bend in the time-space continuum, so that it actually, though the light is going in a straight line, it appears to bend it so that the star is behind the sun, and you shouldn't be able to see it, but you could. So this proved the theory. Again, I used the example 2 weeks ago when we discussed this, that if you're swimming in a straight line and a current, in this case, the sun, is, or in this case, the sun is attracting the space-time, excuse me, this way, so the current's coming here, it's going to push you, wait a minute, I'm getting this upside down. So you're trying to swim to here, but the waves push you, the current pushes you here. I'm not saying this well at all. Well, I think you get the point, is that space-time bends reality in the same way that a current bends the reality of what the medium in which you are swimming or spending. Now, here we get to something very interesting insofar as the relationship between what Abdu'l-Baha is saying in the letter to Auguste Forel, and more particularly in his tablet of the universe, where he talks about things swimming about in a sea of matter. Here, Einstein, who never denied the existence of ether, he simply said what this shows is, the Michelson-Morley experiment, is that light travels at a constant speed regardless of from where it is viewed or in what medium it is shining through. So this is from Einstein. To deny the ether is ultimately assume that empty space has no physical qualities whatever. The fundamental facts of mechanics do not harmonize with this view, for the mechanical behavior of a corporeal system hovering freely in empty space depends not on relative positions or distances and relative velocities, but also in its state of rotation, which physically may be taken as a characteristic not appertaining to the system itself. In order to be able to look upon the rotation of the system, at least formally, as something real, Newton objectivizes space, since he classes his absolute space together with real things. For him, rotation relative to an absolute space is also, so now he's talking about rotation around. He's talking about the orbit. Newton might no less well have called his absolute space ether. What is essential is merely
this is my
that
favorite
besides
part,
observable.
like, and Lynn can be like, this is keeping my son alive.
Excuse me, someone has their sound on. Thank you. What is essential is merely that besides observable objects, another thing which is not perceptible must be looked upon as real, to enable acceleration or rotation to be looked upon as something real. That wasn't very easy to understand, but of course you can come back to it and read it over and over, and as you would scripture, and see if you can understand more clearly the fact that Einstein here seems to be verifying or vindicating what Abdu'l-Baha says about ether, only he's calling it a field of matter. It seems clear then that, and this is my own statement, this is not from Einstein, it seems clear then that when Abdu'l-Baha is describing the ether, it is in the context of his statement in the Tablet of the Universe and the letter to Auguste Forel that there can be no absolute void, that all material reality is composite, and that all materiality is in process of composing or decomposing. That his allusion to the ether is, as Einstein noted, but Abdu'l-Baha's way of describing space, excuse me, in terms of a field of matter through which light, as photons moving in waves, travels, even as do all other forms of energy represented by the electromagnetic spectrum. And here's the electromagnetic spectrum. Here is visible light, what we can see. And then as you get to shorter wavelengths, you go to X-rays, gamma rays, and an infinity of ever smaller rays between that. Or if you go in the other direction, you get extended longer rays from infrared to radio waves and on, presumably infinitely. Now, here's a statement by Abdu'l-Baha about the universe that is sort of pulls all of this information together, the spiritual influences as well as the material influences. But the limitless universe, and this is from Some Answered Questions, is like the human body, all the members of which are connected and linked with one another with the greatest strength. Now, what he's discussing here, interestingly, is he's answering the question about astrology. Is astrology a valid science? And he basically says, not really. In other words, the stars are not, everything in creation affects everything else to some extent, but not in some predictable way. So this is after he's denied the validity of astrology, he says, and yet the limitless universe is like a human body in which all the parts are connected and have some part to play. how much the organs, the members, and the parts of the body of man are intermingled and connected for mutual aid and help, and how much they influence one another. In the same way, the parts of this infinite universe have their members and elements connected with one another, and influence one another spiritually and materially. So here he's showing that the universe is, in effect, one whole reality that has both spiritual and material qualities. This is not talking necessarily about the physical and spiritual realms of the universe. He's saying that the physical universe, which he says is limitless, and again, over and over in the writings, the universe is described as without limits, without boundaries, infinite. And yet it is merely a reflection of the attributes of the spiritual, we don't want to say universe, the spiritual realm. This is the link to a talk by Peter Kahn, who's just a lovely man. I say he is, I presume he still exists in the realm of the spirit, but he was a physics teacher at the University of Michigan before he was elected to the House of Justice. And in this talk, he discusses the magnetic principle and the 5-year plan. Well, before he talks about how it relates to the 5-year plan, he gives a beautiful explanation of the attraction of masses and how these different constructions, from the mineral to the vegetable to the animal to the human, all have the capacity to have a magnetic attraction of spiritual influence. And he quotes from Abdu'l-Baha's tablet, primarily to Auguste Forel, and some other passages as well. It's a wonderful talk. I strongly recommend it. It's on YouTube, and that is the link to it. If you aren't able to get the link off of my site, simply Google Peter Kahn talk on magnetic principle, and you will pull it up. So the structure of the universe. This is Abdu'l-Baha's statement in the provisional. Notice it is a provisional translation. This isn't authorized by Abdu'l-Baha from the Lo-Aflaki, the Tablet of the Universe. Nay, earthly and heavenly, material and spiritual, accidental and essential, particular and universal, structure and foundation, appearance and reality, and the essence of all things, both inward and outward. All of these are connected with one another and are interrelated in such a manner that you will find that drops are patterned after seas, and that atoms are structured after suns in proportion to their capacities and potentialities. For particulars in relation to what is below them are universals, and what are great universals in the sight of those whose eyes are veiled are in fact particulars in relation to the realities and beings which are superior to them. Now this, I hope you understood that. In other words, each particular thing is a universal to those things below it, and it is and the things above it are universal to it. Universal and particular are in reality incidental and relative considerations. The mercy of thy Lord verily encompasses all things. So to demonstrate that, and of course it's in the prayer for the southern states, thou alone hast the power to change a gnat into an eagle, a drop of water into rivers and seas, and an atom into lights and suns. So the basic structure of an atom, this is simply a hydrogen atom, so it's very simple. You have the nucleus, which would be like the sun or star in a solar system. And then you have the various electrons rotating around them at various levels of energy. And you can see that the structure of our solar system is the same way, that the Earth rotates around the sun functions as the nucleus. And one thing interesting in this particular image that I got off a line is, of course, a year for the Earth is 365 days. A year for Mercury is only 88 days, and so on. But you get out to the ends of the universe, I mean, of our solar system. Saturn takes 29 years to rotate around the sun. Neptune takes 164 years to rotate around the sun. So then we go up, so we see the atom emulating the solar system emulating the galaxy. In what way? Well, the basic structure of our galaxy, which we call the Milky Way, is 3,200 solar systems. So you've got in as many atoms in, you've got countless atoms that construct, the Earth or any part of the solar system. You've got 300,200 solar systems in our galaxy. And so here you can see right here is the sun. And you can see that this is the spiral arms rotating around the black hole, which is at the center of the universe. And this is interesting, I think. A day for our solar system is 225 million years. That's how long it takes for our sun to rotate around our solar system. So how many times has it done that since its beginning, since it spun off from whatever was in the middle of this solar system, as we presume our planet spun off from the sun? Well, it has thus far gone about 20 orbits, and it's got about 16 to go before it ceases to exist, the sun. So we've got 16 orbits, 16 days in our galaxy before we go out of existence, though others will be coming into existence to take our place. And then we go beyond the cluster of galaxies. I mean, the cluster of solar systems in our galaxy, and you get what's called a supercluster or cluster of galaxies, and one is called the boss because it's the biggest supercluster they've found so far. It's 10,000 times the size of our Milky Way galaxy. It contains at least 830 visible galaxies. All right. And that's what it looks like, which reminds me very much when I saw it of this, which is the double helix of the DNA. I don't know. Again, everything is from the atom is similar to the solar system to the galaxy to galaxy clusters, and so on. And I just thought it nice to go back there. So this is called a cosmic web. It is the largest known structure in the universe, known. Notice the key known here. I mean, after all, we've just been discovering these things over the last few years that we've got this wonderful telescope. It's known as the cosmic web, and it stretches 6.5 billion light years. In other words, light traveling at the speed of light, as it does, would travel for 6.5 billion years in order to get across this thing. This gigantic structure contains over 800 individual galaxies inside of massive galaxy clusters, which lie inside the cosmic web. So this is a web which has clusters. Each cluster has galaxies. galaxies, have solar systems, yada, yada. And there's the double helix. And this is the prayer for the southern states I was telling you about. Help me to triumph by the host of thy glorious kingdom, and shower upon me thy confirmations, which alone can change a gnat into an eagle, a drop of water into rivers and seas, and an atom into lights and suns. I think that's such a lovely image. So, forgive me for being my voice being so grumbly tonight, but just is. And so we finished with our beautiful architecture done by lovely Baha'i architects, so talented, such a beautiful combination of classic and modern design.